Welcome to the introduction to the Prudent Investment Rule. This rule is an absolute necessity for anyone to know if they're going to work with trust. That's because you're advising a client to start a trust, that you're serving as a trustee for a trust, or you're a consultant to the trustee of the trust. So we are going to look at the background and give you a better familiarity why this is such a complicated rule to follow, because of many people feeling extremely. Our objectives at the end of the session, you'll be able to describe the goals of the Prudent Investment Rule and provide, excuse me for occasionally calling the Prudent Investor, Prudent Investment Rule, because that's what it used to be known as. Today it's the Prudent Investor Rule. Discuss the changes from the previous law and describe why the rule is needed in a modern society. And I should add also why you have to know it. History of the rule. A basic requirement of a trustee is they must act prudently in all that is done for a trust and its beneficiaries. Now, that's not a new rule. That's been around since the concept of trust began thousands of years ago. Again, they didn't call it a trust, but it was a similar type of arrangement. It's also today found in Europe. It's called a usufruct. But in America, we've a little bit different with our trust. We follow the British method. And remember, in all these cases, whenever you have someone whose legal title controls the property of someone who's a beneficiary, that you have a set of rules you have to live by. It's flexible and unspecified standard of care, permitting wide discretion with general rules. And finally, it does not have a safe harbor to identify compliance. So a lot of times there's confusion. I would say your best friend is a trustee, or a trust advisor is an attorney who specializes in trust or estate planning. The principle of prudence for a trustee consists of the following 5 items. First, safeguarding the trust assets, and I think that should be logical, that the assets are being given to you to manage, or to the trustee to manage. Disposing of the trust income and principal, maintaining the trust records, which is, in my mind, not done adequately enough by most trustees. Keeping beneficiaries informed, also not done very well by most trustees, and treating beneficiaries impartially. The trustee is expected to exercise in the following prudence, and this doesn't matter if you have investment assets in the trust or not. You have to exercise care, you have to exercise skill, and you have to exercise caution. And these have continued throughout history. Care, skill, and caution as being a responsibility of investment advisor and people who work with investment advisors. The old rule, which is the old Prudent Investment Rule, was used the first half of the 20th century, and were certain types of investments were imprudent per se, and thus were not allowed for trust. For example, speculative assets. Each investment in a trust portfolio, rather than a portfolio as a whole, had to satisfy the test of prudence. So if you had 30 investments, you had to spend time on each one. Trustee was required to perform duties personally and not to delegate to others. The idea being you were hired because of your specialty, therefore you had to do it all yourself, even though there are people more qualified. Invest in mutual funds or index funds was an improper designation of duty by the trustee, because again, you're having someone else manage the assets when you use those. The new rule really started out in 1992 when the Bar Association of the United States published the 1992 restatement of the law, third time, for trust. And it's used by states, by professional trustees and courts, even though it is not a law itself. It's sort of like the Uniform Commercial Code, the Uniform Probate Code, the Uniform Trust Code, etc. Essence of the rule is there's no investment or techniques that are imprudent per se, including speculative assets or non-income producing assets. And that was certainly a big change from what was in the past, because in the past it had been being very conservative investments. Now we look at the goal of the investee the goal of the trust to find out what is proper and improper. Application of the rule. It's intended for use in a trust only if it's consistent with the terms of the trust and with state law. In other words, the state law overrides the prudent investor rule. The trust overrides the prudent investment rule. In other words, it's a gap filler. If it's not covered by the state or trust, then you use the prudent investment rule. Assuming recognized by state law, then the terms of the trust will dictate whether the new rule applies to the investment authority and activities. 41 states have adopted the new rule. 7 use a modified version, and 2 do not use it. Mississippi and Louisiana still use the old rules, and it's generally used for private and public trust for managing or setting the rules for the trustee. The trust terms, we can look at the terms of the trust, and they have to be read to see if they expand or limit the powers of the new rule. And you're allowed to do that under the prudent investor rule. And I might know one of the hard things many times for trustees to do who are very busy is to read in detail the details of the trust. And that's a downfall of many trustees. And unfortunately, it's a requirement because otherwise you don't know what you can and cannot do. A trustee today can properly make investments as expressly or implicitly authorized by the terms of the trust. A trust term can control a trustee's investment duties and authorities so long as they do not conflict with state law. So there's a lot of flexibility because state laws tend to be very general. And finally, absent contrary provisions or silence in the terms of the trust, the new rule applies in the states that have adopted it. So practically 48 of the 50 states you're going to see is going to be applicable unless it says otherwise in the trust. And again, this is for the investments of the trust we're talking about, not just the trust itself. So let's take a look at some of the basic rules that have for the investments of trust. First of all, diversification is fundamental to risk management and therefore is ordinarily required. I think that's logic for anybody who's in the investment field. Risk and return are so directly related that trustees have a duty to analyze, make conscientious decisions regarding the levels of risk appropriate to the purpose of the trust. There again, you have to read and understand the trust. What do you do when you don't understand what the trust is trying to say? You get legal assistance. Trustees have a duty to avoid fees, transaction costs, and other expenses that are not justified by the objectives of the investment program. Might not believe it, but I've had several cases where I've been involved where beneficiaries did bring actions against the trustee for not being conservative in how they spend the money. And that might be because there was a commission involved that the beneficiaries felt was unreasonable, or there was too many turnovers of the stock, whatever, and they complained. The fourth general principle is the fiduciary duty of impartiality requires a conscientious balance of current income and growth. Both have to be considered. And that's not always easy because especially in a dynamic trust and especially if the trustee or a trust advisor is handling a lot of different accounts. And finally, the trustee must have a duty as well as the authority to delegate as a prudent investor would. And that was, again, going back to the very basics, that we have a duty to act as a prudent investor would. Summary: in this model, we learned the need for a modern trustee rule, the background of the prudent investment rule, which is supplements state law and the trust, and finally the flexibility of the rules as used in trust. So we have a general background of the rules of the trust.